I'm Amy, 32 female. I live alone in a city apartment that I bought with my own hard work, managing multi-million-dollar portfolios for a top finance firm. My life is a carefully constructed fortress of numbers and logic, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of my family. For years, I was the silent benefactor behind my family's perfect image, the secret source of funding for my brother's self-made success. But one dinner, one toast, was all it took to make me decide to burn the whole facade to the ground. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The aroma of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes hung heavy in the air, a familiar scent that used to mean comfort, but now felt like a well-rehearsed stage production. Sunday dinner at my parents' house was a weekly ritual, a command performance where we all played our designated roles. My father, John, a man whose hands were calloused from a lifetime in construction, sat at the head of the table like a king, surveying his domain. My mother, Helen, a retired nurse with a heart of gold and a blind spot the size of Texas, fluttered around him, ensuring his plate was always full and his glass was never empty. My aunt, Paige, my mother's sister, was usually there, her sharp eyes missing nothing but her tongue held in check by a fragile sense of family loyalty. And then there was Andrew, my younger brother, the golden child. He was 8 years my junior, a fact my parents never let me forget. He was the charming one, the easygoing one, the one who could do no wrong. He was in his second year of law school at a prestigious university, an achievement my father spoke of with a booming pride that echoed through every family gathering. Andrew sat across from me, a smug, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips as he recounted a recent victory in a mock trial competition. "The professor said I had a natural talent for litigation," Andrew said, puffing out his chest. "He thinks I'm a shoo-in for the law review next year." "Of course he did," my father bellowed, slapping the table with his palm, making the silverware jump. "You've got the brains, the guts, and the work ethic. You built this all on your own, son. No handouts, just pure grit. We're so proud of you." I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. It was a bitter, metallic taste I had grown accustomed to over the years. I looked at my brother, at his perfectly coiffed hair and his designer watch, a birthday gift from me last year, and I felt a wave of nausea. Built it all on his own. The words were a lie, a carefully crafted fiction that I was an unwilling accomplice in maintaining. For the past 2 years, since the day Andrew received his acceptance letter, I had been the silent, invisible force propelling him forward. Law school wasn't cheap, and my parents, living on a modest retirement income, couldn't possibly afford the steep tuition fees of his chosen institution. When the financial aid package came up short, Andrew had come to me, his eyes wide with a practiced sincerity. "Amy, I don't know what to do," he'd sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I worked so hard for this, it's my dream." I remembered the conversation as if it were yesterday. We were in my apartment, the city lights twinkling below. I had just closed a major deal at work, and the bonus was sitting comfortably in my bank account. I loved my brother, and despite the blatant favoritism he had always enjoyed, I wanted to see him succeed. "How much do you need?" I had asked, my voice calm and practical. He had slid a piece of paper across my granite countertop. The number was staggering. It represented a significant portion of my discretionary income, a sum that could have gone toward my own investments, my own future. But looking at his face, a mixture of hope and desperation, I had agreed. "I'll cover it," I had said, "but it stays between us. I don't want Mom and Dad to feel like they couldn't provide." It was a mistake, a critical error in judgment. I had framed it as an act of kindness to spare my parents' pride, but in reality, I was enabling a lie. Andrew readily agreed, a flash of relief in his eyes that I now recognized as cunning. The arrangement was simple. Every semester, I would transfer $6,000 directly into his account to cover the tuition shortfall. It was a secret pact, a hidden current running beneath the placid surface of our family life. Now, listening to my father's booming praise, I felt like a fool. My sacrifice, my generosity, had been erased from the official family history, replaced by the myth of Andrew the self-made man. I looked at my mother, who was beaming at her son with tears in her eyes. I looked at my aunt, who gave me a quick, almost imperceptible glance of something that looked like pity. "He's always been so." "Driven," my mother added, her voice thick with emotion. "Even as a little boy, he was always so determined to make something of himself." I took a slow sip of my wine, the red liquid doing little to soothe the fire in my gut. The charade was suffocating. I was an unwilling participant in a play where my brother was the star, and I was a nameless, uncredited stagehand working in the shadows. My financial contributions weren't just about the money. They were a tangible expression of my support, my belief in his potential. To have that support not only ignored, but actively denied, was a betrayal that cut deeper than I could have imagined. The conversation moved on, but I was stuck, replaying my father's words over and over in my head. No handouts. The phrase was a dagger, twisting in a wound I hadn't even realized was there. I had always been the responsible one, the practical one. I had worked part-time jobs all through high school and college, paid for my own education with a combination of scholarships and student loans that I had diligently paid off years ago. I had never asked my parents for a dime after I turned 18. My success was my own, forged through long hours, missed social events, and a relentless drive to be financially independent. Andrew, on the other hand, had always had a safety net. My parents had co-signed for his first car, paid his rent during his undergraduate years, and slipped him cash whenever he was a little short. My contributions were just the latest and most significant in a long line of bailouts. Yet, in their eyes, he was the independent one, the trailblazer. As my mother began clearing the plates, Andrew caught my eye and gave me a small, conspiratorial wink as if to say, "Thanks for keeping our little secret." In that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift. The resentment that had been simmering for years finally reached its boiling point. The wink wasn't one of gratitude, it was one of complicity in my own erasure. He wasn't just accepting my money, he was thriving on the lie that it didn't exist. I excused myself from the table, my voice tight. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at me was pale, my eyes dark with a mixture of anger and hurt. I had allowed this to happen. I had let my desire for family harmony override my own self-respect. I had funded the creation of a myth that diminished my own achievements while inflating his. When I returned to the table, my father was in the middle of another monologue about Andrew's brilliant future. "He'll be a partner in a top firm by the time he's 30, you watch," he declared. "He's got that fire, that's something special." I sat down, my hands clenched in my lap. The charade was over. I didn't know how or when, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was going to bring the whole damn theater down. The secret that had bound me in silence was about to become the weapon of my liberation. The Sunday dinner was no longer a family gathering, it was the scene of the crime, and I was about to become the star witness. The drive home from my parents' house was a blur of red tail lights and simmering rage. The city, usually a vibrant tapestry of light and sound, felt muted, its energy drowned out by the storm raging inside me. I replayed the dinner conversation in my head, each word a fresh cut. My father's booming pride, my mother's misty-eyed adoration, Andrew's smug smile, it was a symphony of delusion, and I was done being the silent conductor. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the sprawling metropolis below. Each light represented a life, a story. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of isolation, not from the city, but from my own family. They saw me, but they didn't really see me. I was a supporting character in the Andrew show, my own life and accomplishments relegated to a footnote. The lie wasn't just that Andrew was self-made. The lie was that my contributions were insignificant, that my sacrifices were invisible. It was the lie that his success was more valuable, more worthy of celebration, than mine. I had spent my entire adult life building a career in a competitive, male-dominated industry. I had fought for every promotion, every raise, every ounce of respect. And for what? To be the secret benefactor to a brother who was lauded for a fiction I was paying for. The next morning, I woke up with a cold, hard resolve. The anger had not dissipated, it had crystallized into a plan. I went to my home office, the one I had furnished with the profits of a particularly successful quarter, and I powered on my computer. The first step was to cut off the funding. I logged into my online banking portal, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The next tuition payment was due. In 3 weeks, I had already set up the automated transfer, a recurring payment that was a constant, invisible drain on my finances. With a few clicks, the transfer was canceled. A small pop-up window asked for confirmation. "Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled payment?" I clicked yes without a moment's hesitation. It was a small, digital act of defiance, but it felt monumental. It was the first domino to fall. A few days later, my phone buzzed. It was Andrew. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I ignored it. Then came the text message. "Hey Amy, hope you're having a good week. Just wanted to check in about the tuition transfer. I think you forgot to set it up. It's due soon." The casual, entitled tone of his message sent a fresh wave of anger through me. Forgot to set it up. As if it were a minor oversight, a forgotten chore like taking out the trash. Not a significant financial commitment that I was making at the expense of my own financial goals. I didn't reply. I knew that silence would be more unnerving than any angry response. Let him sweat. Let him wonder. Let him feel, for the first time, the weight of his own responsibilities. The following Sunday, I skipped the family dinner. I texted my mother that I was feeling under the weather, a flimsy excuse that I knew wouldn't hold up to much scrutiny. My absence, I suspected, would create a vacuum, a space for the unspoken tensions to fester. Sure enough, my father called me that evening. His voice was gruff, a mix of concern and annoyance. "You okay, Amy?" Your mother was worried. "I'm fine, Dad, just a headache." "Well, your brother was asking about you. He said he's been trying to reach you, something about his tuition." Here it was, the opening salvo. I kept my voice neutral, detached. "Oh, what about it?" "He said you usually help him out with it. Said you haven't sent the money yet." The way he said it, "help him out," was so dismissive, so trivializing. As if I were slipping Andrew a $20 bill for gas, not funding a significant portion of his legal education. "I've decided not to make that payment this semester," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a stock market ticker on a good day. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in my father's head, the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile his image of the self-made son with the reality of my financial support. "What do you mean, you're not making the payment?" he finally sputtered. "What kind of sister are you? He's counting on you." "I'm the kind of sister who has been paying for his education for the past 2 years while you've been praising him for doing it all on his own," I shot back, the dam of my composure finally breaking. "I'm the kind of sister who is done funding a lie." The line went quiet again. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I had broken the unspoken rule. I had brought the truth into the light. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice defensive. "Andrew is a hard worker. He's earned his success." "Has he?" I challenged. Ask him. Ask him how he's been paying for a top-tier law school on a part-time job at the campus library. The numbers don't add up, Dad. I'm a financial analyst. I know numbers. I could hear my mother's voice in the background, a faint, worried murmur. My father's tone shifted from anger to confusion. He told us he had a scholarship. A scholarship. The lie was more elaborate than I had even imagined. They hadn't just ignored my contribution, they had replaced it with a more palatable fiction. Andrew hadn't just accepted my money, he had actively deceived our parents. The betrayal was deeper, more calculated than I had realized. "There is no scholarship, Dad," I said, my voice cold. "There's just me, and I'm done." I ended the call before he could respond. I sank into my chair, my heart pounding. The truth was out, at least to my father, but the war was far from over. I knew Andrew. He wouldn't go down without a fight. He would twist the story, paint me as the villain, the jealous sister trying to sabotage his success. And he did. The next day, I received a barrage of texts from him, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last. "How could you do this to me, Amy? You're going to ruin my life. I was going to pay you back, you know I was. You're just jealous. You've always been jealous of my relationship with Mom and Dad." The accusations were ludicrous, but they were predictable. It was the classic narcissist's playbook: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. I didn't respond to any of them. I was gathering my ammunition, preparing for the next battle. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the truth. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. The lie had cost me more than just a fortune. It had cost me my place in my own family. And I was determined to get it back. No matter the cost. The golden child's pedestal was about to crumble, and I was the one who was going to kick it out from under him. The days following my phone call with my father were a study in strategic silence. My family, a unit that typically communicated in a flurry of daily calls and texts, went radio silent. It was an unnerving quiet, the kind that precedes a storm. I knew they were talking about me, just not to me. I imagined the hushed phone calls between my mother and Aunt Paige, the tense conversations between my father and Andrew. I was no longer a daughter or a sister. I was a problem, a variable that had disrupted their carefully balanced equation. This period of forced isolation gave me time to think, to move beyond the initial, white-hot rage and into the colder, more calculated territory of strategy. My brother's accusation of jealousy, while absurd, had a kernel of truth to it, though not in the way he intended. I wasn't jealous of his relationship with our parents. I was furious that the relationship was built on a foundation of lies, lies that I had unwittingly helped to construct. My professional life had trained me to be meticulous, to follow the data, to find the patterns hidden beneath the surface. I decided to apply that same skill set to my brother's life. If he had lied about the scholarship, what else had he lied about? My financial support had been the latest and most significant deception, but I suspected it was not the first. Andrew had always been adept at crafting a narrative that suited him, at bending the truth to fit his desired reality. My investigation began where all modern investigations do, the internet. I started with his social media, a carefully curated gallery of his perfect life. Photos of him studying in the hallowed halls of the law library, candid shots of him laughing with friends at trendy bars, a picture of him volunteering at a soup kitchen, a photo op if I had ever seen one. It was a masterclass in image management. But social media is a two-way street. I started looking at the accounts of his friends, the people he tagged in his photos. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a crack in the facade. It didn't take long to find one. A friend of his had posted a series of photos from a spring break trip to Cancun the previous year. There was Andrew, front and center, on a yacht, a bottle of expensive champagne in his hand. The date stamp on the photo caught my eye. It was from the same week he had called me, his voice strained with worry, claiming he was so broke he couldn't afford to fix the brakes on his car. I had transferred him $800, no questions asked. Seeing him on that yacht, living a life of luxury on my dime, was a visceral gut punch. It wasn't just that he had lied, it was the casual, effortless nature of the deception. The Cancun trip was a breadcrumb, a clue that led me down a rabbit hole of his past expenditures. I had his bank account number from the tuition transfers. While I couldn't access his account directly, I had other means. I was a financial analyst, after all. I knew how to read the signs, how to follow the money. I started by reviewing my own financial records, cross-referencing every transfer I had ever made to him with his social media activity. The pattern was damning. The emergency, request for money for a new laptop, coincided with a weekend trip to a music festival. The unexpected dental bill aligned with the purchase of front-row tickets to a professional basketball game. Each request for help, each sob story, was a carefully constructed fiction designed to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. But I needed more than just my own records. I needed irrefutable proof, something that would dismantle his narrative in a way that even our parents couldn't ignore. I thought back to his undergraduate years. My parents had paid his rent, but he had always complained about being short on cash. I wondered how he had managed. A long shot, but I decided to reach out to an old college friend of mine who had attended the same university as Andrew, a few years ahead of him. Her younger brother had been in the same fraternity as Andrew. It was a tenuous connection, but it was all I had. I met my friend, Sarah, for coffee. I was vague at first, just asking about her brother and his fraternity. Sarah, a gossip at heart, was more than happy to share. "Oh, that fraternity was a mess," she said, stirring her latte. "A bunch of rich kids with too much time and money on their hands. My brother got out after a semester. Couldn't stand the entitlement." I pressed on, my heart rate quickening. "Do you remember him ever mentioning my brother, Andrew?" Sarah's eyes lit up with recognition. "Andrew, short, dark hair, always wearing a smirk. Yeah, I remember my brother talking about him. He was the treasurer for a while. There was some kind of scandal, I think. Something about the accounts not adding up after a big charity fundraiser." "Bingo." "A scandal?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "What happened?" "I don't remember the details," Sarah admitted. "But my brother said it was a big deal. The guy who came in as treasurer after your brother found a bunch of inconsistencies. I don't think anything ever came of it officially. Fraternities like to keep that stuff in-house, but your brother left the fraternity pretty quickly after that." It was the smoking gun I was looking for. Andrew hadn't just lied to me, he had a history of financial misconduct. He wasn't a struggling student, he was a con artist, and our family was his primary mark. I spent the next week digging deeper into the fraternity scandal. It was difficult, as Sarah had said. These organizations were notoriously secretive, but I was relentless. I tracked down the name of the student who had replaced Andrew as treasurer. His name was Mark, and his LinkedIn profile said he was now working as an accountant in a city a few hours away. Taking a deep breath, I crafted an email to him. I was direct and honest. I told him who I was, that I was looking into some financial discrepancies involving my brother, and that I had heard he might have some information. I knew it was a long shot. He had no reason to help me, a complete stranger. To my surprise, he responded within a day. "I remember your brother," the email read. "And I remember the mess he left behind. I'm not sure what I can share with you, but I'd be willing to talk." We arranged a phone call for the following evening. I was nervous, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. Mark was cautious at first, but as I explained the situation with the scholarship and the constant requests for money, his tone softened. "That sounds about right," he said with a sigh. "Look, after Andrew stepped down as treasurer, I found a black hole in our accounts. We had just hosted a big philanthropy event, raised over $10,000 for a local children's hospital, but the final donation was $5,000 short. There were no receipts, no paper trail, just a series of cash withdrawals from the fraternity's bank account that Andrew had authorized." My blood ran cold. This was worse than I had imagined. He hadn't just stolen from me, he had stolen from a charity. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We confronted him," Mark said. "He denied everything, of course, said it was a bookkeeping error. But we knew. We couldn't prove it without a full-blown audit, and the national chapter didn't want the bad press. So we made a deal. He would quietly resign from the fraternity, and we wouldn't take it any further. The rest of us had to pool our own money to make up the difference for the donation. We couldn't let the charity suffer because of him." I thanked Mark for his time, my mind reeling. From the revelation, the golden boy, the self-made man, was a thief. He had a history of deception, of exploiting the trust of those around him for his own financial gain. I now had the ammunition I needed. This was no longer just about tuition payments and hurt feelings. This was about exposing a pattern of behavior that was toxic and destructive. The unraveling was complete. Now, it was time to start weaving the net. Armed with the damning revelation from Andrew's former fraternity brother, I felt a grim sense of validation. I wasn't the crazy, jealous sister. I was the one who had finally seen through the carefully constructed facade. But a phone call with a stranger wasn't enough. My family, particularly my parents, operated on a system of belief, not evidence. To truly dismantle the myth of St. Andrew, I needed more than a story. I needed a paper trail. My professional life revolved around documents, balance sheets, income statements, audit reports. I knew that numbers don't lie. People do. Andrew had been careless, arrogant in his belief that he could outsmart everyone, that his charm would always be enough to smooth over any inconsistencies. My job now was to translate his arrogance into a language my parents couldn't ignore: cold, hard proof. The first step was to organize the information I already had. I created a spreadsheet, my mind slipping into the familiar comfort of data analysis. I listed every transfer I had made to Andrew, not just for tuition, but for every emergency that had cropped up over the years. Next to each payment, I added a column for the reason he had given me, and another column for what I now suspected the money had actually been used for, complete with links to his social media posts as evidence. The Cancun trip, the music festival, the basketball tickets, it was all there, a digital diary of his deceit. But this spreadsheet, while compelling to me, was still my word against his. I needed third-party documentation. The fraternity scandal was the key. Mark had mentioned cash withdrawals. If Andrew had been foolish enough to use the fraternity's debit card for his own expenses, there would be a record. I contacted Mark again. I explained my predicament, that I needed something tangible to show my parents. I asked if he, by any chance, had kept any of the old bank statements or financial records from his time as treasurer. It was a huge ask. I was asking him to dredge up a painful memory and to potentially expose himself to legal trouble. I expected him to refuse, but Mark, it turned out, was a man who valued integrity. "It's funny you should ask," he said, a wry tone in his voice. "When I took over, I was so paranoid about being blamed for the mess that I made copies of everything from Andrew's tenure. I have a folder in my cloud storage with scanned copies of all the bank statements from that year. I'll share it with you. Just be careful. Your brother is a piece of work." When the link to the folder arrived in my inbox, my hands were trembling. I opened it, and there it was, a year's worth of the fraternity's financial life, laid bare in a series of PDF files. I spent the next 2 nights poring over the documents, my eyes scanning line by line, cross-referencing dates and amounts. It was tedious, painstaking work, but my adrenaline was running high. And then I found it, a series of cash withdrawals, just as Mark had said. But there was more. A charge at a high-end clothing store for over $600, a dinner at a steakhouse that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, a payment to a luxury car rental company, all made during the weeks leading up to the charity event, all from the fraternity's account. Andrew hadn't just stolen the cash, he had been treating the charity fund as his own personal slush fund. The final piece of the puzzle was the most damning. I found a record of a wire transfer from the fraternity's account to a travel agency. The amount was just over $2,000. The date was 2 weeks after the charity event. On a hunch, I went back to Andrew's social media, scrolling back through his posts from that year, and there it was. A photo album titled Eurotrip 19. Pictures of him posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, sipping a beer in a German beer garden, eating gelato in Rome. The trip had taken place a month after the wire transfer. He had used the stolen charity money to fund a European vacation. I felt a profound sense of disgust. It was one thing to lie to his family, to take money from a sister who was trying to help him. It was another thing entirely to steal from a charity, from a children's hospital. It was a level of moral bankruptcy that I hadn't thought him capable of. I meticulously documented everything. I highlighted the relevant transactions on the bank statements. I took screenshots of his social media posts, matching the dates to the fraudulent charges. I created a timeline, a clear, linear narrative of his deceit. Tian, the final product was a 10-page report, complete with a summary, supporting documents, and a conclusion. It was the kind of report I would prepare for a high-stakes corporate client, and I was about to present it to the most difficult board of directors of my life, my family. The final piece of my preparation was a legal one. I was about to accuse my brother of theft. I needed to understand the potential ramifications. I booked a consultation with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in family law and financial disputes. I laid out the whole story, presenting her with my report. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she looked at me, a glimmer of admiration in her eyes. "You've done your homework, Ms. Evans," she said. "This is an incredibly thorough and well-documented case of financial malfeasance." She advised me on the legal definitions of fraud and theft, the potential civil and criminal liabilities Andrew could face if the fraternity or the charity decided to press charges. She also warned me about the potential for a defamation lawsuit if I couldn't back up my claims, a warning that only strengthened my resolve to stick to the undeniable facts. "Your strongest leverage," the lawyer concluded, "is the threat of exposure. Your brother has a future career in law to protect. The last thing he wants is a public record of financial misconduct. You hold all the cards, Amy. The question is, how do you want to play them?" I left her office with a clear head and a steady hand. I now had the evidence, the legal understanding, and the strategic framework. The paper trail of deceit was complete. It was no longer a tangled web of lies. It was a straight line, leading directly from Andrew's greed to his downfall. The next Sunday dinner was in 2 days. I was ready. The charade was about to end, not with a quiet fizzle, but with a loud, resounding bang. The week leading up to the next family dinner was the calm before the storm. I spent my days at work, immersing myself in the familiar world of spreadsheets and market analyses, a welcome distraction from the impending confrontation. But in the evenings, my apartment became a war room. I rehearsed my lines, anticipated their reactions, and planned for every contingency. This wasn't just about revealing the truth, it was about controlling the narrative. For too long, Andrew had been the author of our family's story. I was about to seize the pen. My plan was simple, but it required precision timing. I didn't want a screaming match. I didn't want a messy, emotional implosion. I wanted a controlled demolition, a systematic dismantling of my brother's carefully constructed world, executed with the clinical precision of a surgeon. The day before the dinner, I prepared a package. It was a simple manila envelope, but inside it contained the entirety of my investigation. I had printed everything: my spreadsheet of his emergency requests, the highlighted fraternity bank statements, the screenshots of his lavish trips, and a summary of my conversation with Mark. I also included a final, crucial document, a formal promissory note drafted by my lawyer. It was a legally binding agreement for the repayment of the $48,000 I had given Andrew for his tuition, plus the additional $7,200 for the various emergencies he had fabricated over the years. The total was $55,200. The note outlined a clear repayment schedule, set to begin the month after his graduation. I made 3 copies of the package, one for my father, one for my mother, and one for my Aunt Paige. I knew that Paige, with her quiet intelligence and her position as a semi-objective observer, would be a critical ally. My parents were blinded by their love for their son. Paige was not. On Sunday, I arrived at my parents' house exactly on time. I was dressed in a simple, professional dress, my hair pulled back in a neat bun. I wanted to project an aura of calm, of control. As I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. My mother greeted me with a strained smile, her eyes darting nervously between me and my father. My father sat in his usual armchair, a thunderous expression on his face. Andrew was already there, perched on the edge of the sofa, looking like a cornered animal. He refused to make eye contact with me. Aunt Paige was the only one who greeted me normally, giving me a warm hug. "Good to see you, Amy," she whispered, giving my arm a supportive squeeze. We sat down for dinner, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery against porcelain. My father, usually so boisterous, was ominously quiet. My mother tried to fill the void with small talk about the weather and a neighbor's new puppy, but her words fell flat in the heavy air. Finally, my father cleared his throat, the sound like a gavel calling a court to order. He looked at me, his eyes hard. "Amy, we need to talk about this situation with your brother. You've put him in a terrible position. He could be forced to drop out of school." I placed my fork and knife down, my hands steady. "I'm happy to talk about it, Dad," I said, my voice even. "In fact, I've prepared something to help facilitate the conversation." I reached into my bag and pulled out the 3 manila envelopes. I slid one across the table to my father, one to my mother, and one to Aunt Paige. "What's this?" my mother asked, her hand trembling as she reached for the envelope. "It's a summary of my financial relationship with Andrew for the past 4 years," I explained. "It includes bank statements, receipts, and a timeline of events. I think you'll find it very illuminating." Andrew's face went white. He shot me a look of pure venom. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "I'm providing clarity," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Something that has been sorely lacking in this family for a very long time." My father ripped open his envelope, his brow furrowed in anger. My mother opened hers with a sense of dread. Aunt Paige opened hers with a quiet, deliberate focus. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound was the rustling of paper. I watched their faces as they processed the information. My father's anger slowly morphed into confusion, then disbelief. My mother's eyes filled with tears, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at the evidence of the stolen charity money. Aunt Paige's expression was one of grim, unsurprised sadness. "What is this, Andrew?" my father finally said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He held up a copy of the fraternity's bank statement. "It says here you spent $600 at a designer clothing store using the charity fund." Andrew stammered, his usual smooth demeanor cracking. It's a misunderstanding, a bookkeeping error." "And the trip to Europe," my mother whispered, her voice choked with tears. "The pictures you sent us, you told us you won a travel grant from the university." Andrew was floundering, drowning in the sea of his own lies. I let the evidence speak for itself. I didn't need to raise my voice or make accusations. The documents did the work for me. They were a cold, impartial judge, and their verdict was clear. Finally, my father looked at me, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of shame, anger, and a dawning, painful understanding. "You've been paying his tuition all this time." "Yes," I said simply. "Every semester, and for every other emergency he's had. It's all in the report." He slumped back in his chair, the bluster gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time, not as the golden child, but as the deeply flawed man he had become. The revelation was orchestrated, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of truth. The silence that followed was not the tense, angry silence of before, but a heavy, mournful one. The family myth was dead. The charade was over. And in the wreckage, we were all forced to confront the uncomfortable truth of who we had become. The stage was now set for the final act, the declaration that would not only sever my financial ties to my brother, but would also redefine my role in the family forever. The aftermath of the revelation was a landscape of emotional debris. My mother was openly weeping, a quiet, heartbroken sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My father, a man I had never seen look defeated, stared at the documents spread across the dining table as if they were the wreckage of a plane crash. Aunt Paige was looking at Andrew with an expression of profound disappointment. And Andrew, the golden child, the star of the show, was finally, irrevocably silent. The smirk was gone, replaced by a pallid, clammy sheen of fear. I let the silence hang in the air for a few moments longer, allowing the full weight of the truth to settle. The foundation of their world had been shattered, and they were all standing in the rubble. It was time for my declaration, the final, decisive move that would set the terms for the future. I cleared my throat, and all eyes turned to me. "As you can see," I began, my voice clear and steady, devoid of the anger that had been simmering for so long, "there has been a significant and long-term pattern of deception. This is not about a single lie or a single mistake. This is about a fundamental breach of trust." I looked directly at Andrew. "You didn't just lie to me, Andrew. You stole from me. You stole from a charity. And you built your entire life on a foundation of lies that you allowed our parents to believe." He flinched, but for the first time, he didn't have a clever retort or a manipulative excuse. He was exposed, stripped bare of his defenses. I then turned my attention to my parents. "And you," I said, my voice softening slightly, but still firm, "you were so invested in the story of the self-made son that you refused to see the truth that was right in front of you. You praised his grit while I was the one paying his bills. You celebrated a fiction because it was easier, because it was the story you wanted to believe." My father had the grace to look ashamed. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "I'm not done." I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out the promissory note. I slid it across the table to Andrew. "This is a legally binding document," I explained. "It details every dollar I have given you under false pretenses. The total is $55,200. It outlines a repayment plan that will begin 1 month after you graduate from law school. You will sign it, or I will walk out of this house and never look back. And I will also forward this entire file of evidence to the dean of your law school and to the State Bar Association. Your career in law will be over before it even begins. The choice is yours." The threat was audacious, brutal even, but it was necessary. It was the only language he would understand, the language of consequences. Andrew stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at our father, a desperate, silent plea in his eyes. But my father, for the first time, did not come to his rescue. He simply shook his head, a look of weary disgust on his face. "You made this bed, son," he said, his voice gravelly. "Now you have to lie in it." My mother sobbed harder, but she didn't intervene. Even she, in her state of heartbroken denial, seemed to understand that a line had been crossed, that this was a reckoning that could not be avoided. With a trembling hand, Andrew reached for a pen. He read the document, his face a mask of disbelief. He had never faced a real consequence in his life. He had always been protected, bailated out, forgiven, but that was over. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, the ink a stark, black testament to his downfall. I took the signed document and placed it carefully in my bag. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. My financial support is, of course, terminated, effective immediately. How you choose to fund the remainder of your education is your problem to solve. I looked at my parents, my aunt, my now indebted brother. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the silent, overlooked daughter. I was a force to be reckoned with. "I love you all," I said, and it was the truth, as complicated and painful as that love now was. "But I cannot be a part of this family dynamic any longer. The lies, the favoritism, the willful blindness, it's toxic, and I'm done. I need space. I need to build a life for myself that isn't defined by the role you have all cast for me." I walked to the door, my footsteps echoing in the silent room. Aunt Paige stood up and followed me. She gave me another hug, this one fierce and proud. "You did the right thing, Amy," she whispered. "It was hard, but it was right." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. I walked out of the house, not looking back. The cool night air felt clean, fresh. I had walked into that dinner as the family's dirty little secret, the silent, unacknowledged benefactor. I walked out as the master of my own destiny, the architect of my own future. The dinner party was over. The declaration had been made. The old world was in ashes. It was time to build a new one. The weeks and months following that fateful dinner were a period of profound and unsettling change. The severing of ties, while necessary, was not without its pain. The silence from my family was no longer a tense, strategic quiet, but a vast, empty chasm. My parents, caught between a lifetime of doting on their son and the undeniable proof of his deceptions, retreated into a cocoon of confusion and shame. They didn't call. I didn't either. The weekly Sunday dinners, the command performances that had defined our family life for so long, simply ceased to exist. The only person I heard from was Aunt Paige. She called me a few days after the confrontation, her voice a comforting balm on my raw emotions. "They're in a state of shock," she explained. "Your father is wrestling with his pride, and your mother is wrestling with a broken heart. It's going to take them time, Amy." Paige became my bridge back to a world I wasn't sure I still belonged to. She gave me updates, not to draw me back into the drama, but to reassure me that life was, in its own fractured way, moving forward. Andrew, she told me, had been forced to take out a substantial student loan to cover his final year of law school. He had also taken a job as a bartender, the late nights and demanding work a stark contrast to his previously charmed life. The golden boy was finally learning the meaning of grit, and he was learning it the hard way. Without the financial drain of my brother's life, my own world began to expand. The $6,000 I had been transferring to him every semester was now being diverted into my own investment portfolio. I watched it grow, a tangible symbol of my reclaimed future. I had more disposable income, more freedom. I started traveling, taking weekend trips to places I had always wanted to see. I invested in myself, taking a course in pottery, a hobby I had long been curious about. The feeling of the clay spinning beneath my hands was therapeutic, a reminder that I could shape my own world, create something beautiful out of a formless lump. I also reconnected with friends I had neglected, my time and energy no longer consumed by the emotional weight of my family's dysfunction. I was lighter, freer. I had spent so many years as the responsible one, the caregiver, the secret provider, that I had forgotten what it was like to simply be Amy. About 6 months after the dinner, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my mother. Her handwriting was shaky, the words on the page stained with what I imagined were tears. It was not a letter of apology, not in the way I might have expected. It was a letter of grief. She mourned the family she thought she had, the son she thought she knew. She expressed her confusion, her pain, her love for me, a love that had been overshadowed by her blindness to my brother's faults. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply asked if one day we could have lunch, just the two of us. I agreed. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe halfway between her house and my apartment. It was awkward at first, the conversation stilted. But slowly, tentatively, we began to build a new foundation, one based not on secrets and lies, but on a fragile, emerging honesty. She told me that my father was in counseling, trying to come to terms with his role in creating the dynamic that had allowed Andrew to flourish unchecked. It was a shocking revelation. My father, a man of stubborn pride, had admitted he needed help. The first payment from Andrew arrived on the exact date stipulated in the promissory note. It was a small amount, the minimum required, but it was there. It was not an act of contrition, I knew, but an act of self-preservation. But it was also a sign that the consequences were real, that the world he had created for himself had irrevocably changed. My relationship with my parents is still a work in progress. It is not the relationship it once was. It is something new, something more honest, and, I hope, more resilient. We are learning to communicate without the buffer of secrets, to see each other as we are, not as we wish we were. I am no longer the silent benefactor, the invisible force propping up a false narrative. I am the architect of my own life, the master of my own finances, the author of my own story. The foundation I am building is my own, forged not in the shadows of someone else's success, but in the bright, unfiltered light of my own truth. And for the first time in a very long time, my future feels entirely my own.